Welcome to today's PAWSCAST.
Hi everybody, I'm Dr. Amanda Vanderveer and I'm here with Marcy Childs, therapist at CAPS here at Frostburg State University. And today we're going to talk about grief. So at some point in our life, we're all going to experience grief, and sometimes it can be really hard to work through. So Marcy, could you tell us a little bit about grief and what that means?
Tough one to give a definition to. In fact, in preparing for this, I wanted to kind of go do a little bit of a search and see what I could find. I mean, the American Psychological Association defines it as the anguish that follows a loss. And I remember specifically that definition because they choose to use the word anguish.
Yeah.
And I thought, boy, if that doesn't say it all, that's a pretty heavy word.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, we look at grief as being a time of distress around experiencing a loss. Probably for the purposes of our conversation, we'll talk mostly about bereavement, which is like losing a person to death. But there are so many different losses we grieve in life. Relationships, loss of a role. I know I'm kind of going through the empty nest thing as a middle-aged mom, and so, I'm looking at a big transition there, and certainly grieving some of the things I used to do as a mom versus, what that means now. Sometimes grief can relate to a decision we've made in our lives that, looking back on it, we might regret or, have qualms with it that way. So grief definitely has an expansive definition to it in terms of what types of loss it covers. But like I said, we will probably stick to the bereavement type of grief, which is certainly, I think, what we most associate with the word grief.
Yeah, but it's important to recognize that there are other types beyond loss of a person. Some of the students might be going through, we just did a PAWSCAST on coming to college and your first semester, first year of college, and check that out, guys. So that can be something that causes grief, just like leaving home for the first time and coming to college can be grief.
Absolutely, yeah. and I think with that
particularly,
well, the transition with coming to college, of course, we're kind of taught to focus on all the cool things about it, and I'm going to have this independence, and I'm going to have my own space, and I'm going to make new friends. And it's funny because we can almost predict with some certainty when we'll start to see students rolling into the counseling office because they are dealing with a side to it they didn't quite expect. Mm-hmm. It may be just certain things about home, the smells in the air, the temperature of the room, that they'll start to notice that they're missing. And so there is kind of a grief process involved there.
Absolutely, there's a lot going on. Mm-hmm. So how do we tend to experience grief?
Well,
or should I say, what's the healthy way to experience grief?
Well, a big caveat, it's going to vary from culture to culture, particularly between Eastern and Western cultures. I remember the day I learned this lesson about Western cultures being what we call grief avoidant, whereas in a lot of Eastern cultures, you find that they take time with the grief process. There are many, many rituals which can go on for years, and so I guess we'll talk within the dominant Western culture as far as what we experience, what kinds of things we might go through. Obviously, grief is, there's a quote by, it's an 18th century poet, and I've forgotten his name, but he wasn't that famous anyway. But the line that struck me was, in this one poem I was reading of his, he said, "Grief is the medicine." Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of times we forget that actually grief is our spiritual medicine, our psychological medicine, and like a lot of medicines, it doesn't taste very good going down, but it's very necessary for the healing. Yeah. So the worst thing I feel like you can do with managing grief is to not manage it, to try to hide from it, try to avoid reminders of your loved one that you lost. Another form of escape would be using substances to try to kind of escape the emotional intensity of the loss. As hard as it is.
Amazed, people drink at wakes.
Yes.
Alcohol is a depressant, y'all. So, what are you doing?
Right.
I'm not saying go out and take uppers by any means. Good Lord, don't. But don't contribute to the issues either.
And two, a lot of times you do find that being certainly part of a Irish Catholic tradition. Yes. You get,
Scottish.
my family on my dad's side, that was very much the thing.
Yes.
You know, prop them up in the corner, let's have a beer.
Mhm.
That in and of itself is not necessarily terribly problematic because of the context you're having that drink in with family and as
Yeah.
part of that experience. I think where you want to start to look for trouble is, are you drinking on a daily basis? Is it particularly, like, are you noticing you want to drink because you start thinking of Aunt Mary who you miss horribly?
Yeah.
And so you really have to examine your motivations around it. You know, and
Absolutely.
if you find yourself wanting to use substances to avoid thinking of that person or avoid the pain that goes along thinking about that person, then you can get into, you know, some real problems with like alcohol and stuff,
Absolutely.
and with properly attending to your grief,
Right.
which definitely needs to be done.
Yeah. We have a lot that we need to do in dealing with our grief. And that's really important. So how can we process our grief?
I always like to look at, as part of like therapy, when I do therapy with clients, I always tell them, like, when they come in with grief issues, your task is a few steps. The first step is going to be talking about that person and what that person was to you, what they meant to you as part of your, you know, day-to-day life. The next step is going to be trying to figure out what your life is now without that person's presence in your everyday, day-to-day life. They take on a new presence in your life, they certainly can, and kind of defining, okay, what's that about? You know, what is that going to look like for you? Because the primary goal is to get people to move from what we call an acute grief to what we call an integrated grief. Acute grief is going to come with a lot of more negative connotations. We're going to cry a lot. We're gonna you know, get depressed more often. We're going to have a lot of problems getting up and going on a daily basis. But that's when you're right in the throes of the loss, you know, and that can last anywhere from a couple of months out to about 6 months. Now, obviously, you can revisit acute grief. It's not like you know, you may have the anniversary come up, right?
Yeah.
But you really want to see people at about a 6-month mark be able to move toward that integrated grief where, yes, I still get kind of sad from time to time, but it doesn't take me to the depths of hell when I feel sad. Or I also can laugh a little bit at some of the memories I have about that person. And so it takes on a much kinder, gentler expression for you. The issue is if you get beyond about that 6-month mark, you can definitely stay in what we call like a complicated grief stage. It can take a toll on your health. It can take, you know, your immune system, and then it can take a toll on your ability to get up and go make a living, take care of family members. So we definitely want to see people be able to start moving from that acute grief to that integrated grief. Like I said, within about 2 to 6 months, you want to see that process start to play out.
That makes sense because it is an awful long time to spend in that deep, dark of it all.
Yeah, and again, like, obviously everybody's different, and it's going to depend on things like, you know, your relationship with that person, how close you were, how complicated the relationship was. There are several factors that go into kind of determining, you know, I guess, like, the depth of your experience with the loss of that person. And whether or not you do kind of go back into those deeper, more acute stages of grief, maybe when you experience an anniversary. Something like that. So I don't want to give people the idea that, okay, acute grief, now I must move on to the integrated and go from there. I'm never going to revisit the harder stuff. You will from time to time, but generally speaking, you're able to pick yourself up, get out into the world and get through your day without, you know, the grief shutting you down. And
you were talking about, like, sometimes we go back and forth, like with the stages of grief. I think most people have either heard of it or know what that is. There's this mentality that you go through these stages and you reach acceptance and everything's all better for the rest of your life. But that's not how it is it?
No, not at all. And yeah, I mean, look, the stages of grief have been a wonderful, wonderful tool. Back when it was Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she was a nurse who worked with a lot of people who were, and she actually started out with her stages theory applied to the people who were dying. And she noticed after some time and some of, you know, some more in-depth work that this was applying also that the people grieving were going through very similar stages. And so for those who don't know, she had 5 stages. started out with denial, just the idea that the person doesn't even accept the loss on any level. And then you'd move on to like a depressed stage. I think it was anger after that. Bargaining, where it's like, I'll do anything to keep this person here with me. And then ultimately acceptance.
Yeah.
As people began to take that more literally, it became more problematic because it's just not that neat. And they couldn't just apply this very neat template over grief and go, now you're in this stage and next you'll move to this stage. Yeah. There's nothing sequential about it. You can definitely flip back to earlier stages. You can be in multiple stages at once, you know, and have different facets of multiple stages going on. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the stage theory is wonderful. We just have to make sure we're being flexible with it, you know, and not trying to make it this neat and tidy system.
It's not a little checklist.
Right, right, yes. Nothing about grief is that neat, for sure.
Yeah, no, it is not. So what is normal and what isn't when we're experiencing grief?
That's such a tricky one, again, too, because culture definitely plays a role. I mean, there are some cultures in this world, I cannot remember the term for it, but they will actually cannibalize their lost loved ones. Yeah. Considered completely normal and within, you know, the norms and mores of their culture, their society. But within, you know, basically what I guess we here in the Western world understand about it, it's so important to ritualize, to participate in some sort of a memorial, being with community. I think a lot of us tend to want to isolate with our grief, but in the initial throes of a loss, that's really the worst thing we can do. Grief is very much a social process, and you can go way back in history and we see that, you know, this is something communities did together. Yes. Is to memorialize the person, create rituals around the losses. So participating in, you know, any type of religious practices you may have. If you don't have religious practices, you certainly don't need to identify with any certain religion to come up with ways to kind of like memorialize the loss of a person. Yeah. And, you know, so making sure you take time to do that. Again, staying connected with, particularly with people who knew the loved one and also lost the loved one. I think because that kind of creates a little miniature support group with, you know, within your own family and circle of friends. And so being able to talk to other people who also share memories of that person, who also saw, you know, maybe how things ended for them and can really relate to you on, that shocked me too, or I didn't see it going that way either. You just have that built-in set of empathic ears because that person kind of walked that walk too. In terms of like, I always say, like, obviously from a disordered DSM point of view, I talked a little bit about, you know, acute versus integrated grief. And in the DSM, they mention what we call uncomplicated grief, anything before 6 months. Then it moves on to complicated or prolonged grief. And that's where we can kind of like put a diagnostic label on it. But I always say, you know, consider getting help with a loss before it ever gets there. You know, it's wonderful to have somebody to process loss with. It doesn't need to be a therapist. It could be, again, if you have a religious faith and you have a religious leader, that's a wonderful role that they can, you know, fill in. So, you know, consider like leaning on different supports that you have available to you. And again, your ability to handle the grief, it's going to depend on a lot of things, including, do you have access to the resources, you know, the things that you need to be able to kind of cope with the loss. What kind of loss have you experienced in the past? Have you been through a lot of traumatic losses, or, you know, grief is cumulative. So it's not just this death you're going to be grieving through. It's going to open Pandora's box for everyone you've lost in the past. Yeah. So,
it can be very complex. Yeah, absolutely.
Definitely.
So what can we do to help others, other people who are grieving in the grieving process?
It's really tough. And how many times have somebody's expressed a loss on Facebook and you hate to go and comment and do the thoughts and prayers are with you, or it almost feels like no matter what we say, it's going to ring a little hollow or a little bit simplistic. But believe it or not, those simple platitudes go a long way, because for the person just to know that somebody is acknowledging their loss, that goes a very long way. So, you know, reaching out to people, sending that card of condolence or a message on social media, something like that, definitely helps. It's in the help column. Another thing you can do is listen to them and employ empathy, when you're listening. Don't judge anything they're saying about their loss. Certainly don't minimize it. I think one of the worst things we can do is feel like, well, but you barely even knew him. Don't, you don't want to quantify or qualify a person's, the value of that relationship.
It's been a couple weeks. Haven't you gotten over this?
Yes. And that's a big one we do in our culture, right? We
my gosh.
3-day grief in America. Yes. The person dies, we bury them, and everybody's all better now. And unfortunately, it doesn't have a timeline like that. It's not that neat. Yeah. And so that's how we do end up with a lot of folks who end up kind of staggering into that complicated grief, by not getting to really work through things initially in a very healthy way. I think it's something like, it's 10% that they know of Americans. I wanted to find numbers for Americans in particular, but about 10% will have what's called uncomplicated grief. Again, the normal grief process kind of carry over into that, where we put a diagnostic label on it and say, okay, this is getting problematic and it's starting to impact your health and other areas of your life. So, sometimes I think if we were a little bit better at handling loss, we might be able to be a little healthier in the loss after we experience it.
I agree. If it was more normalized in our society, well, that person is going through a deep loss, like a loss of a pet. How many times have I heard, it's just a dog, it's just a cat.
Big mistake.
No,
Big mistake.
It's a member of my family.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah, so,
And I'm glad that we are starting to, I really feel like that's come a long way as far as pets are concerned, but you still see the odd remark about, oh, it's a dog, you can get another one, and you can get one that looks just like them, and give them the same name. It's like, don't do that.
No.
Don't do that.
How it works. Right. That's not how it works at all.
No.
Yeah. Now the next stage is like, let's get the 3 days of bereavement for that, because oof.
Yes.
Yes. So, is there a worst thing that we can do when we are grieving? Like, if you had to pick out, what's the worst thing we could do?
I'd say the worst thing we could do is avoid
just complete
the pain,
avoidance.
avoid thinking of the loss, avoid the world, isolating, that sort of thing.
Distracting ourselves with other stuff. Yeah.
Because I think, and look, we're talking about probably the deepest pain any human being could ever feel. So the temptation to want to avoid pain, we kind of, have this idea that pain is bad and we don't want to experience pain. And so I think the short-term relief is enough to drive a lot of us to that temptation, and then I just know, like, long-term, the picture is usually not going to be great in terms of, like, what you're left with, and kind of the lingering issues you might experience for not having really been able to walk through it authentically and really experience your grief.
Yeah. What type of resources are available on campus?
Well, you have the counseling and psychological services, which our name may be changing. That's why I'm sitting here stuttering over it, because I'm like, but nothing official yet. So obviously we have our office. United Campus Ministries, a great place to start there, and you have several student-run religious organizations on campus. Always hit them up. The SAFE office, of course, and I think that's about it on campus. I had searched to see if there were any type of bereavement support groups in Frostburg. I know there's one down at UPMC that they run. Circle of Friends, I believe, is the name of the support group. The last I had heard, they mostly dealt with loss to cancer.
Okay.
I wasn't able to find anything on whether or not they've opened that up, so not sure about that part of it, but
that's something someone could Google, like bereavement groups or something like that.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of and let me preface this with, be careful out there, but there are some resources available on the internet, some virtual bereavement groups. I would definitely recommend going through a trusted source like PAWSCAST is a fantastic resource for anything related to losing a loved one. I mean, they have information on support groups, information on different resources available. So Hospice of America, a great website to visit if you're looking for resources.
Those are really great resources. And if you're a student on campus, I highly recommend talking to your teachers, talk to your advisor, talk to your RA, talk to your friends, because they're resources too.
Absolutely. Like with it, it's a community process, grief is. And so the more you, even though it may feel antithetical to what you want to do, wanting to hide the wounds and, isolate away, it's actually the healthiest thing to do, to reach out to other people for support. Yeah, and they don't need to have a, degree or a license or anything. Friends are a great source of support in those situations.
Absolutely. So are there any other things you'd like to add that we didn't talk about that we might have missed?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, that's fine. That's
off the top of my head.
Well, thank you so much, Marcy, for coming in and talking with us today and sharing your experience and knowledge about grief and how we go through the grieving process. If you guys are out there grieving a loss and you're struggling, please come in, talk to the SAFE office, talk to someone at CAPS, and please seek help, because there are people here ready and willing and able to help you. So thank you for watching our PAWSCAST today. I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank you for being a part of our PAWSCAST. This health and wellness podcast is brought to you by the Prevention Center and Peer Education Network at Frostburg State University. If you would like more information about our programs, visit us in Pullen Hall, room 109, or call us at 301-687-4761. Or you can always send us an email at safeoffice@frostburg.edu. Remember to watch our other episodes and stay tuned throughout the semester. Thank you!